Hello, everybody. This is a weird situation. I have 3 people in the room and some people outside, but I'm very happy to be here. And it's also today the beginning of my short guest stay here in Lund at both Lydmiljøcentrum and Architecture. So first of all, I want to thank Sanne, who's not here today, but at home. She's hopefully online. For the invitation, and also to Sandra Koldkjær from Architecture here in Lund. She's my host for the next 2 months. So today I want to talk about an attuning approach to sound art and design in public spaces. And I want to talk about that through 4 of my practice-based research projects from the last 10 years. From when I started my PhD about noise and sound in Danish hospitals 10 years ago, until today, where I'm employed as an assistant professor in sound studies at Aarhus University. And I also work as a composer and sound artist, both in hospitals, but also in various shared and public spaces and institutions, as well as theaters and venues, normal places for artists. In this lecture, I want to argue that working with sound in such messy and often challenging contexts calls for an ecological and inactive methodology entailing investigations of actors and their interrelations with their respective environments as attuning and explorative agents. I have thus aimed to develop this attuning approach as a framework aimed at accommodating both the multisensory atmosphere and the active engagement of the inactive user over the past 10 years. So taking this as my starting point has consequences for how we consider listening and a listener that challenges the idea that a normal listener exists as a model that we can build our solutions or buildings for. As we see in, for instance, this ISO standard on acoustics, where the otological normal hearing person is a person between 18 and 25 in a normal state of health, who's free from all signs of or symptoms of ear disease and from obstructing wax in the ear canals, and who has no history of undue exposure to noise, exposure to potentially ototoxic drugs, or familiar hearing loss. So how many is in that category? In this room, I would say maybe in the back, I don't know. But I'm not. So instead, I adhere to a model of oral diversity of the listener as termed by, for instance, John Drever, where listening is considered a complex experience spectrum shaped by a range of contextual factors, similar to how listening is described by the deaf percussionist Evelyn Glennie in her hearing essay that you can find online here. She describes how she answers back to people asking how she can hear what she plays, being deaf, where she answers, who can say that when 2 normally hearing people hear a sound, that they hear the same sound? I would suggest that everyone's hearing is different, as listening is a complex process where vibrations and signals are attuned with all kinds of other meaning-making processes, such as other senses, but also memories, etc., that all make up listening. So she might have other parts involved in this process, but as she says, to hear, all I do is to listen. So thinking about the importance of considering the oral, diverse and exploratory listener also became the starting point of my PhD project in hospitals. Because I started the project at the same time of being a fairly new mother of 2 small boys. And as you see here, I ended up in the hospital with my then 2-year-old son on the left, who was going in for a minor but urgent surgery. He had a fever and he had fasted around 18 hours upon arrival. And he was bedded in a 4-bed ward with 3 other children recovering and eating after their surgeries. And he was very brave, but also very hungry and sick. It was clear to me that both of us were acting braver than we actually were, because we shared the ward and the soundscape with other families, very, very aware of not making too much noise. The door to the hallway was open, and suddenly I saw my son shocked, looking out the door as this drony, swishy sound that you hear now slowly became louder and louder. He covered his ears, as you see in the picture, with his hands and searched with his eyes to confirm what the sound was the sound of. And I told him that it was a claw cleaning machine, but still he was very afraid until he saw the machine going past the doorway a few times. So being a mom, but also at that time a PhD student doing a project about the experience of noise in Danish hospitals, I tried to calm him while reaching the phone and taking this picture. Looking at the picture later on, something in this expression reminded me of the famous expressionist painting, The Scream from 1893 by Norwegian painter Edvard Munch. There's something similar, not only in the background, but also in the gesture of covering his ears and his eyes looking down. I had always thought that the painting was a self-portrait of Munch screaming. However, in the light of this experience, there was something incongruent in the combination of him covering his ears and screaming at the same time. My son was trying to be as quiet and still as possible while covering his ears, to be able to monitor the presence of sound at the same time that he wanted to shut out, to be able to confirm that everything was okay. Subsequently, I tried looking into the story behind the painting by Edvard Munch, and I found this passage from his diary where Munch describes the feeling he tried to express. In the picture, it's dated 22nd of January 1892, and I quote, "One evening I was walking along a path. The city was on one side and the fjord below. I felt tired and ill. I stopped and looked over the fjord. The sun was setting and the clouds turning blood red. I sensed a scream passing through nature. It seemed to me that I heard the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked. This became the scream." So Munch in the painting is not screaming. I'll just go back to the picture here. It's the sudden presence of a frightening atmosphere that screams at him, leaving him frozen, covering his ears to shield himself against this thick presence of horror surrounding him. So it's not the loudness of the surrounding sounds that makes him cover his ears, but the atmosphere that overwhelms him. The original German title for the painting given by Munch is actually Der Schrei der Natur, the scream of nature. It is most likely that the acoustic environment in this situation was fairly quiet outdoor ambience. Based on the diary note, it seemed to be the combination of his state of tiredness and the visual experience that changed his experience of the sound. The vibrational affective atmosphere moves him almost physically, as with my son, more violently than any sound, and leaves him frozen, unable to break out of the situation. Similarly, my son's experience in the hospital emerged as a complex interaction between the unknown, sterile atmosphere and his hungry and tired state, and the fear of what this hospital was going to bring. Furthermore, the horror was amplified by the multisensory context of sound coming from this unseen and unknown source, and the inability to go and explore the source because he was confined in bed. At the time of this experience, I was reviewing the existing research on the topic of noise in hospitals as a part of the PhD that shared this existing research shared consensus that hospitals are filled with stressful noise, counteracting well-being, health, and the process of healing. And this assumption underlying the field builds on research that identifies raised noise levels as the main causal explanation for ranking noise as a critical stressor. So this explanation establishes a direct causal link between raised noise level and the effect of experiencing noise as a main stressor. And therefore, the most widely used strategies to tackle the problem in hospitals are strategies to reduce measurable and perceptible noise levels. And I identified these strategies as, first of all, insulation or acoustic strategies, but also what I called isolation strategies, which is, for instance, using headphones with music for shorter periods to isolate the patient from the chaotic soundscape. However, research has also found that these strategies do not solve the problem, and the healthcare industry is still struggling to address this so-called noise problem adequately. Based on my experience in the hospital, I wondered if this causal link between raised noise levels and the effect of experiencing noise underlying the field might wrongly take for granted that it's the same noise that the cause and effect refer to. What we might have experienced as noise could be conditioned mainly by non-acoustic factors, such as multisensory, contextual, and atmospheric conditions, that the existing methods and strategies would most likely not be able to neither measure nor address in practice. Cultural theorist and musicologist Ian Biddle argues that through such assumed causality, we install a materialism of noise in detaching noise from the conditions in which they are made and encountered, and thereby install a certain politics of sonic autonomy. He argues that we must question this alignment of noise to what Foucault has termed formidable materiality. Formidable. Is that a word? Yeah, formidable. Thank you. Happy that you are here. Materiality, which somehow resists or exceeds the analytical trajectories through which it is constructed. The result is that noise is considered something in itself and at the same time somehow unavailable. Likewise, our idea, in Denmark at least, of pastoral idealized silence as the other side of the coin is embedded into this idea that there is a quiet and balanced world somewhere, and that it's our job, therefore, to restore this balance by removing noise through protective measures until the problem has been solved. This logic is very similar to the way that sound and noise is treated in Denmark in general, as a way of thinking about the sonic environment as a site of contagion that must be stilled, hushed, managed, and it presupposes a dichotomous divide between the experiencing object and the subject and the object of noise as consistent concepts that can be understood through different representational frameworks. And this state also has the consequence that we have specific orientations towards the world and also the understanding of the normal listening subject, as it presumes a division of the senses as different channels, which can be addressed individually as discrete faculties, and thus encourages research to start in what Don Eid has called sensory atomism. And secondly, listening as a passive process, where it's cut off from the other senses and their bodily interplay. So with my background in the interdisciplinary field of sound studies, combined with my practice-based approach through sound art and design related to the field of sonic interaction design, it surprised me that this research stressed the importance of it surprised me that the research in sound studies always stresses the importance of considering contextual conditions in relation to listening, while research in sonic interaction design calls for an ecological and inactive approach, but this is not integrated into the way that we work with sound and noise. And furthermore, research from the field on hospitals and listening also point towards such contextual and embodied factors from sound studies in relation to the experience of noise, as for instance, sound anthropologist Tom Rice's work in English hospitals and James McCrill as well. And I have summarized a few of their key points on listening in the hospital. And first of all, they characterized it as an atmosphere of absence. Again, a multisensory parameter where the lack of sensory stimuli, such as visual and olfactory stimuli, and a general feeling that the hospital inhabits an unusual atmosphere of absence amplifies sound-related annoyance. So again, a non-acoustic factor that influenced the experience of noise. And next, an alarming sonic sensibility the alarming soundscape of the hospital and the lack of dynamic background sound sensitize foreground and attentive listening modes, which amplifies again sound-related annoyance. And last but not least, a lack of coping skills and active coping possibilities. The inability to actively exert control over sound-related stressors in different and changing situation and context also enhances this sound-related annoyance. However, I found very little practice-based work that focuses on these contextual aspects, despite the fact that the new super hospitals, as we call them, in Denmark, what you saw in the map before, are built on what we have termed brugernes sundhedsvæsen, a human-centered approach to design, and also healing architecture, and a focus on how our senses should be tackled as a part of health. And so going into the process, I wanted to take a first step towards how to work with these conditional factors with the atmosphere. And it was taken with a project called Kitkit, where the primary aim was not the concrete intervention, but to explore how to couple the entanglements of complex atmospheric quality of space with a model of the human being as embodied, inactive, and situated. It was conducted in collaboration with architect Sofie Kink at a neurointensive care at Aarhus University Hospital, where patients are hovering between life and death due to severe head and spine injuries. And as you see in this small video, on the left-hand side of the corridor is a small waiting room where relatives often spend hours before going into one of the two wards on the right hand, each holding 3 beds separated by a glass monitoring room where 6 to 8 nurses and doctors monitor the patients. During the experimental phase, we conducted user studies, prototyping, observations, interviews, field recordings, and atmosphere walks, together identifying a wish of nurses to motivate parents to bring children to visit relatives to help demystify this situation. However, there was a lack of tools to prepare for the alarming atmosphere in this ward, which is dominated by a cacophony of up to 15 alarms, different alarms per bed, and it's 3 beds in the ward. As the shift from the atmosphere of absence in the waiting room to the ward resulted in the child often standing frozen against the wall, unable to focus on the visit. The existence of atmospheres in everyday experience is often taken for granted and thus remains unnoticed. Yet in the last 20 years, scholars have argued that atmospheres are vital to our everyday experience of places and situations. And one of the central figures in this research area of atmospheres and sound is the French sociologist Jean-Paul Thibault, who argues that we do not perceive atmospheres as such. Rather, we experience on the basis of atmospheres as a sensory background that specify the conditions under which other phenomena or sounds appear and emerge. Atmosphere constitute our immediate, all-encompassing experience of finding ourselves in environing worlds, as Gernot Böhme has put it, involving our entire range of senses, but often unnoticed by our direct attention. In other words, an atmosphere should be understood not as an abstract concept or a metaphor or a property of a thing, but as a relational thing or attunement. A focus on listening should therefore take its starting point in this situation in this multisensory atmospheric sense, suggesting that we do not hear the sound in itself, but units of meaning on the basis of situational backgrounds. And very importantly, these backgrounds then become zones of inquiry open to intervention, manipulation, innovation, but also domination and control. So how can we help the child to avoid becoming controlled and dominated by this powerful atmosphere in the ward, when atmospheres are mostly something we are not aware of, something affective and prior to our cognition? And thus we cannot simply consciously delete them by saying you should not focus on this. So I turn to Heidegger that suggests that agency towards existing Stimmungen or attunements must be exerted tactically in a mediated fashion through what his term is Gegenstimmung or counter-attunement. Thus, inviting for attunement understood as a process where several elements are brought into a responsive relationship, and counter-attunement in the listening domain could then be instructive for how to work with atmosphere or changing our ways of attuning to an atmosphere. And counter-attunement can only emerge if it resonates with the existing attunement. So if one are to be affected by the counter-attunement, it needs to catch the existing attunement. In this way, facilitating counter-attunements demand a rupture between one, here an existing attunement, and another, here a counter-attunement. A counter-attunement can thus only be achieved by creating an object or event of affective attachment in an existing attunement that challenges it from the inside, so to say. So drawing on Daniel Stern, Jonathan Flatley suggests how such objects of affective attachment can be brought into being by getting close to patterns of intensities and rhythms between different objects and actors in a situation through sensible exposure. And thus, very importantly, we have to consider attuning capabilities and capacities as something that are not fixed, but that we constantly develop throughout our lives. And Kirsten Jacobsen says that these attuning relations is a way of finding things at a distance through making them effectively close to us. I'll come into the concrete in a very short while, because what she says is that now it's presented to us when we bring them close as separated in their closeness. We can then make them belong to a new specific region, for instance, a background. And I just want to quote her: "Things are only ever far from us on the basis of their being close to us." And most of these processes, habituating processes, happens unnoticed through repeated everyday embodied habituations in our normal everyday life. You know, when you reach for the coffee or you do habituated actions, it's of course done unnoticed because you do it every day, and slowly you build up this embodied habituations. But others happen when a sudden rupture to a habitual action creates a moment where there's a need to recalculate. A rupture that acts as an attentional cue, inviting us to consciously experience both the setting, the background, and ourself as a closeness, after which repeated and slow embodied habituation can result in a new refined attunement, a new habituated relation where the rupture can move to a background relation. I just brought this example for people that are visually oriented, and this is a staircase, but it's a ruptured staircase, as you see. But we understand that this is a staircase, and we would probably need to try it a few times to learn to walk on this, but this is exactly what's meant by a rupture to a normal attunement of a staircase, and then how we can learn through embodied, repeated experience to rehabituate this stair. And after a week, we might be very good at walking at this staircase. And another example of this change through rupture, through repeated action, is one of Diana Deutsch's famous now auditory illusions. You might have heard this before, but I use it as an example of how we can change our habituated way of listening to speech, for instance, through through repetition. And so you just have to listen to this example, and I hope you can hear it in this room. I think that the speakers are my speakers here, but is it? Okay, I'll try.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 sometimes behave so strangely.
Now I can't really ask people what they hear, but most people hear a melody slowly emerging from the speech. Did you also? And if you hear it again now, what happens is most often is that you hear her going from speech to song. But the first time that you heard it as just speech, of course. So let's hear just one repetition so you can hear if you changed your habituated listening. Sorry. Sorry. I'll just have to stop this. Sorry. There are two. Here we go. That's not the right way to share it. Oh, it's because I have to do it like this. All right. Sorry. Okay, I'll just skip it when we heard it just one time.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
Sometimes behave so strangely. So I just wanted to show you this because I also have students that I've played this clip 10, 15 years ago, and they still have this new habituated way of listening to this small clip. And so with Kitkit, we wanted to experiment with this process of counter-attunement in practice and created this interactive furniture that you see placed in the waiting room where families spend hours waiting to go into the ward. And we wanted to engage the child in purposeful counter-attunement to intentionally and actively change the existing attunement of the alarming sounds in the ward. So through this touch interface that you see, you could play with the alarm sounds that I've sampled from the ward, and they could, through this simple sound interaction, create these attentional cues that hopefully could make a new habituated relation to these alarming sounds and place them in the background of attention by bringing them close. So by listening to these rhythms and shifts, we could gain, or the child could gain, an attentive ears, enabling the atmosphere to change by moving this specific attention from a foreground attention towards a background attention. And we could, or the child could do this in a rhythm that was in sync with their own bodily rhythms. And so what we did was that they could then afterwards bring this interactive furniture, it was on wheels, and bring it into the ward to bring something familiar again, something habituated, and taking the focus away from the shift from the waiting room to the ward. And then in the ward, it could be folded out into a staircase, so you could walk up on this small furniture. And I'll just show a short clip here.
Så vi herinde, så kan vi lige snakke lidt om, hvordan mor har det. Lige sådan noget, jeg vil vise det her nu. Beep. Trækker du i den der? Så kan vi tage den med ind til mor. Gør vi det? Så går vi herhen til den her side. Ind ad den dør her, Martha. Kom herhen i sengen. Jeg er lidt træt lige nu også. Og se her, hvis du lige går lidt til siden der, så spænd det, så sætter jeg dem lige den her fast. Kan du huske, hvordan du åbnede den før? Kan vi prøve det igen? Det er den røde, vi skal have op først, ikke også? Hvad er det så for en? Er det den grønne? Sådan.
Did it go away?
Se,
Okay.
nu træder op her. Så kan du komme op og sige hej til mor.
Det starter faktisk først herovre.
Starter med herovre, men det må du også godt. Det er simpelthen
Okay,
frem.
we need to.
Prøv nu bare at kravle op der.
All right. So I just wanted to show you this example as a way to work with theoretical concepts in practice and use creative work to also think about concepts such as atmospheres and rhythms. And in this way, constructive design research, as we called it at the time, offered a concrete way to surface new understandings of how this attuning approach could be approached in practice. But this also highlights the problem of tackling noise in hospitals, not only as a symptom of this philosophical problem that I stated in the beginning with our understanding of noise versus silence, but also questions who should work with sound and noise in hospitals. Who is it that we could open this area with? Because in Denmark we don't have a long tradition for practice-based research outside of architecture. But we're slowly beginning to renegotiate, you could say, the role of artists and also designers, also in the universities these days. As I did with my PhD project, but also my collaborator Morten Ries, who I did the next project with, that we called the Overheard. And we wanted to create a project in 2017 where sound artists facilitated new everyday listening situations to open up new ways of listening to our everyday surroundings through sound sculptures and installations as these sonic ruptures, as Jordan Lacey has coined it, and open towards new attunements. Put briefly, the project comprised 6 public available site-specific sound installations across central region of Denmark. During Aarhus 2017, we were the European Capital of Culture, and the sound sculptures could be visited both physically on site, but also, as you see here, virtually through a website, streaming high-quality real-time audio from all the different locations. So you could use this as your own soundscape soundtrack throughout the year. And this website allowed listeners to create this soundtrack by blending the sound of the installations. And the different sound sculptures attracted more than 50,000 visitors because we were also the European Capital of Culture. And we invited bands and artists to use these live streams in their concerts as well, and curated and created something called Overheard Labs that use the sculptures as an opening for discussions on themes such as noise and silence across disciplines. And shortly, I'll just show you the 6. It was here. The 6 sculptures. After this small presentation. The first one is by Swiss artist Simon. His piece was one of his largest to date, made for Godsbanen in Aarhus. This installation was made of 2,030 cardboard boxes, 435 motors, small motors, and 750 meters of rope, and created a very layered, noisy sound when you went through this old godsbane. And the next one is Estonian artist Birgit Oigus, who created these wooden megaphones, 3 meters long. The site chosen is a glade on a small island in a forest area with lakes and streams, but it's also flanked by a relatively busy road on the other side, which was chosen to add this sonic component of amplified engine noise into these megaphones, to also break this idea that it's only the visual field that controls how we experience a place. And this one is Gravitational Vibrations by Søren Lyngsø, built in Mønsted Kalkgruber. It's a huge limestone cave and contains a set of electromagnetic coils that cause piano strings to vibrate and create sounds. It's difficult for you to hear here. And then there's wind and water. It's a permanent sound sculpture by Frode Gundorf Nielsen at Gimsinghoved in Struer, consisting of 12 resonating pipes that together constitute 12 tones, producing melodies through air pressure and water. And then this work is by me and Morten Riis, and it's called 4,140 Voices, and it's a composition made of in a memorial monument in Aarhus. The material is based on recordings of citizens of Aarhus reciting the names that are engraved into the walls. And tower music here is by Jonas Kirkegaard in an old water tower in Horsens, and consists of 54 automated music boxes on acrylic panels placed along the walls of the stairwell. So climbing this stairs to reach the viewing platform, we found ourselves wrapped in these slightly dissonant soundscape from the music boxes. And the large scope of this project was chosen in order for us to broaden the discussion of noise and sound, as I said, and to challenge this understanding of silence versus noise. The overheard name was framed through an artistic exploration of the Danish word overheard. I don't know if you have that in Swedish. Overheard? No. In Danish, the word is what I have learned is called an auto-antonym, which is a word that has opposite contradictory meanings, depending on context. So in Danish, it can both mean to overhear, meaning to zoom in your listening attention towards something that's not directed to you in the first place, but it can also mean not hearing or overhearing, where you vaguely sense the awareness of something, but as it is habituated, you are capable of not giving it a direct attention. You sort of let it go, but you still know it's there and accept it being so. And this move of overhearing allows us to make home in and through our habitual atmospheres. And theorist Brendan LaBelle highlights this overheard, he also uses that term, as a sonic background that we navigate through, and it's a generative aspect of our ways of going through the world. And he emphasizes that we need to relearn this skill for overhearing, as most people today tend to focus on a simple signal-noise dichotomies, for instance, through a controlled background-foreground relationship, for instance, when we go with our headphones and control our everyday environments. Thus, we place ourselves in not heard instead of overheard environments, which in turn prevents us from attuning to atmospheres as generative sites. So the sculptures here are created to invite for ruptures that open up these zones in the listening domain and facilitate a relearning skill of overhearing. As for instance with the forest megaphones, where the symbolic shape of the cone signify sonic amplification. The iconic hearing aids, gramophone funnels, hinting people at listening to the environment. And the busy road is visually hidden behind the trees, and thus would typically fall into the category of background noise. But as these megaphones invite for listening more carefully and directing the attention to all sounds, both the ones outside normal attentional focus, the reduced signal-noise dichotomy is revealed and questioned. Yeah, and just for time, I'll jump to the third project, which is also a large-scale project about Danes' ambiguous relationship to wind turbines. I don't know if you also have that in Sweden, but Denmark is, as you see here, it's a windmill map, of Denmark. It's a windmill country, but Danes have this very ambiguous relationship to them because, of course, we want the green energy, but most Danes want them to stay in the background. However, it seems that our country is simply too small to keep them in the background. They make noise, and their visual presence destroy, a lot of people think, views of so-called unspoiled nature, which we don't have in Denmark, but anyway. Therefore, the installation of these wind turbines has become an aesthetic and sensory problem, a problem of shared atmospheres. And that's the sound of a wind turbine very close. Ash and Gallagher argue that taking the concept of attunement seriously, maybe I should turn this a bit down. Can you hear what I'm saying in the... Okay, on top of this? Perfect. They argue that taking this concept of attunement seriously encourages us to concentrate on relations between body and world as a process of material exchange, translation, and differentiation between a variety of human and non-human objects, rather than a gathering or organization of forces by human perception. And they argue that this requires a shift in our methodological imagination and the vocabularies that we use to express that, in order to understand what it means to be attuned through exploring the transmissions and translations of energies in between. And a transducer is a device that converts energy from one form to another, and a wind turbine is a transducer that converts energy of wind into rotational energy by means of the wings. But our ears and our bodies are also transducers in a long chain of other transducers, including speakers and microphones, together forming what we right now experience as the presence of a wind turbine. In his chapter Transduction in the book Keywords on Sound, Stefan Helmreich refers to how his own fieldwork on submarines has shown how the feeling of being underwater relies on transduction chain of sounds from outside to the inside sound world. This experience points to how these transductions summons up experiential realness or sense of being in the presence of an underwater atmosphere. He therefore argues for a transductive anthropology that listens closely for distortions and resistances that reveal the conditions beneath any presence or atmosphere. So zooming into the rhythms of the windmill, we explore what it means to be attuned by how the materiality of the wind turbine behaves, interacts, develops, and translates through other objects. It's impossible to ever catch a sound of a windmill in itself without its countless translations. And these translations are always inconsistent, as well as our hearing is always a mishearing as well. And this windmill project therefore asks if opening a zone of attunement in relation to the windmill through exploring these fragile transductions could move away the farness between the things and allow us to rehabituate the wind turbine. So just to explain what you are watching here, throughout 2018, everybody was invited to follow one of the world's largest offshore wind turbines live on this web page. And on this page you could listen 24/7 to this giant, but we needed a rupture to catch the existing attunement, but also to create this affective attachment for people to facilitate a new habituation process. So therefore we created an algorithm that could stretch the songs of the band Nephew, which is a very big Danish band, to which I was also a part of at the time. So it was easier to get the songs. So we stretched these songs to the shifting rhythms of the wings rotation. So what you hear here is a mix between the soundscape at the side and then the songs that are then stretched in the rhythm of the windmill. So some days you could sense the song's melody and text because there was like a lot of wind, and other days it was just this, as you hear now, more ambient sound. And the project here did not only unfold through this website. We also used the live stream from the wind mill or the wind turbine in our sound and visuals. You can see it in the back here. And we also have now a song about sound turbines in the Danish version of the most famous Danish songbook called Højskolesangbogen. So we're very proud of that. Yeah, so this attuning approach, as you see, requires a slowing down in order to attune to these transductional mistranslations between things and atmospheres, and restrain in many ways our need to uncover situations and produce knowledge about the world, but instead we aim to attune to this fragile process of not knowing or listening. As Jane Bennett puts it, knowing is not about seeing from above or outside, but a matter of interacting. And what we saw in the wind turbine project was that the summer of 2018 in Denmark got stuck. Suddenly the weather just stopped. So in this year-long listening to the wind mill, we unexpectedly came to listen to a broken seasonal rhythm. A break that was out of phase enough that it broke with the rhythms that we normally rely on, that we don't even notice. And it said that the summer of 2018 in Denmark was where the broad public in Denmark understood the agency of our current ecological crisis, because they could now feel it through their own bodies, even though I know you should distinguish weather and climate. But anyway, and this project suddenly became about that as well, without us knowing beforehand. So I want to end the last minutes with a current project where we are creating, I don't know if it's called that in English, but I'll say sensory maternity wards in 2 hospitals by introducing multisensory and what is termed biophilic design as well, which is the practice of connecting people and nature within our built environment and communities. And just to go a bit into childbirth situations in Danish hospitals, there's a large number of contextual factors, of course, that has been shown in research to be important for a natural birth. For instance, a study from Denmark shows that a homely atmosphere in Denmark, we say hyggelig atmosphere, can provide a better birth experience by reducing stress and anxiety levels And the hormone oxytocin promotes a natural birth. It works optimally when the mother feels safe and relaxed, while the hormone adrenaline, on the other hand, inhibits or completely stops the progress of the birth. So the environment has a significant effect on the amount of oxytocin measured in the blood during birth. So studies have also shown that patients can reduce negative emotions such as stress, fear, and pain when experiencing images from nature, which has a direct physiological effect on blood pressure and heart rate. And also, it's described how to use positive distractions to remove attention from pain or anxiety. And a study has also shown that stimulating patients with images and sound, the perceived pain can be reduced up to 60%. But there's very little evidence in this area, I want to say. And with this project, we try to take some steps in also developing research in this area. So just to describe the project, the region hospital North Jutland, around 3,000 children are born every year. And all of the 4 maternity wards are now furnished, as you see on the left-hand side, not on the right-hand side, with this multisensory installation, atmosphere design, we call it, and furniture. And right now, the big super sygehus, super hospital in the middle of Denmark, is creating 7 new sensory maternity wards as well. And of course, to improve the overall birth experience. And what we are working on is drawing the local nature. So we have interviewed soon-to-be parents about where they go to find peace and in nature. And then we have been gathering field recordings, and nature photographer Morten Hilmer, he's there. We had snow last year in Denmark. That's not often, but he's there. And we are then going out to these locations and recording both, as you see, visuals, but also field recordings, and then bringing them into that's me trying to catch some some Danish sound. And our sound, the sound part of it is mostly soundscape recordings or field recordings. But we also work with what we have called soundscape generated music, which basically is using the recorded sounds, but then resonating to create music from existing tonality in what's already there in the field recordings. I think I have a small video. I just want to say, when I show this, that this is not used in the maternity wards. This is just a test when we were trying to develop this way of making music. And I say that because there's insects, and we don't want that in the maternity ward, but it's a very easy way to understand the way that we make the musical part of it. I don't know if you could hear it here, but... So when you enter the maternity ward, the moods, we call it moods, different moods, they are synced with the time of the year and the time of the day, also to strengthen the rhythms that we are also a part of, even though we are in the hospital. And then you can choose afterwards, you can choose different moods. And this is really important because research has also shown that we enhance perceived safety through also giving control and making the couple or who's in there giving birth competency to be able to set the atmosphere and change the atmosphere as well. And there's been research done already in a test ward in Herning that has shown that the involved parents remember the experience of giving birth better than in normal wards. So this is really interesting, I think, in relation to atmospheres. And another interesting thing from this test study was that there's an alarm button where you can turn this off completely and then introduce the normal light, and it's never been used. So it's really important. So even though you often have alarming situations, you don't need to change or turn off this yet. But right now, different research projects are going on in these new wards, and I'm doing a study about working environment in before and after this change. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. 3 minutes. I think maybe I should just end here. Then we can see if people have questions. And is there something that I forgot? Yeah, I just want to show you a last, just so you see that the video you saw, because it's very long, it's because it has to fill 3 walls. So this is actually one of the new awards, and this mood here is what we call a functional mood, because it's meant as a tool for midwives to help breathing exercises. So it's a bit more foreground than background, this one, but it supports the rhythm, breathing with rhythm. They are not giving birth, they're just not at the time.